All right, I see in the chat that James said I should go ahead and get started while he works on his audio. I'm not sure if my audio is also choppy. If it gets bad, I can also turn off my camera and just walk you guys through the slides that might improve the audio quality. So, my name is Niki Okuk. I'm really excited to join you from Los Angeles. Here in Los Angeles, I serve on the board of Downtown Crenshaw, which was an effort of the South Central community to push back against gentrification by collectively and cooperatively purchasing real estate and developing cooperative businesses. Our biggest ambition was actually to purchase the Crenshaw Mall, which is a huge commercial hub here in South Central Los Angeles. We're still in a pitched battle with that landholder, but in the meantime, we've continued to build community and raise money, and we've purchased about a dozen other homes and apartment buildings in our community, which are held in a land trust. And we are working on developing cooperative businesses through a variety of mechanisms. Now, the thing that I came here, oh, sorry, I should tell you a little bit of background on me. The reason I have started to build cooperative businesses is that I was a small business owner for many years. For nearly a decade, I had a truck tire recycling business in South LA. Where our revenues were about $1 million to $2 million a year. We employed 20 to 25 folks. Had a large warehouse in Compton. However, as many businesses do, right? We had very low margins. We had very high real estate costs. And so the question was, how do we build businesses that are more sustainable, that can pay people living wages, which really got us looking towards a cooperative model. Now, we ended up closing that business because of those small margins and high rental rates, right? So it's given us a big education and sort of what qualities to look for in businesses when you're trying to build cooperative businesses. And I'll get into that a little bit later. I think towards the end, I'll talk a little bit about Downtown Crenshaw and what kind of our thinking and strategy is around how to both incubate and acquire and transition businesses into a worker ownership model, which James outlined really so well earlier. So I don't think I need to go into the details of what worker ownership can look like. And honestly, it can take on a variety of different models. But I am going to start sharing some slides and walk you guys through some of the cooperative sort of ecosystems that we have seen all over the world. So let me get those slides up here. Sorry, James, I'm not sure if there is a setting that you would need to change for me in order for me to share my screen. Here, I think I have it. There we go. So let's get this in presentation mode. Great. Is everybody able to see this? I don't know how to check that. Maybe James, you can chat me and let me know if you're seeing this. So here's some working examples of cooperatives. I'll talk a little bit about cooperative home care workers, home care associates, which is in the Bronx. That was started as a cooperative. It is one of the largest in the country. Arizmendi Bakeries, which is out here in California, and Obron, which is actually based out of Colorado. So one of the largest cooperatives is called the Drivers Cooperative, and that has 6,000 worker owner members in the United States. It is very different from the Uber and Lyft drivers model, with 10% higher wages, and it is actually also cheaper for the customer. They also have a rule of law committee for terminated workers. So that's probably the largest example. I'm sorry, before I had said that it was our healthcare workers. Now, Cooperative Home Care Associates is one of the largest that I'm aware of. They're based out of the Bronx. Now, this is a really interesting cooperative where home care workers came together and took what is typically actually a very low paying job, and through their worker ownership model have increased all of their wages overall. And also they're now a unionized unit of SEIU, Service Employees International Union. They are also able to pay out surplus. James was talking about year-end dividends. The home care cooperative associates in the Bronx is able to pay out returns almost every year, year over year. Now, COVID was an exceptionally challenging year, but they're still in business and they're still thriving. They have an interesting model in that it takes you about 2 years before you're invited to become a worker owner. And that's a question that I get, I think, most often about cooperatives, which is, oh, can anybody just, walk in off the street and then become an owner and then sort of derail, what you may have spent years building? But every cooperative that I've encountered has different rules about how long it takes to become an owner. And in the case of the Cooperative Home Care Associates, it takes 2 years before you're invited to become an owner. Arizmendi is very interesting. So Arizmendi is probably one of the longest going ones here in the US, I believe over 30 years in business, which is quite remarkable for any restaurant. But probably a testament to the strength of their cooperative model, in which they have a sort of a federation of bakeries, and each location then feeds up in both decision making and funding into sort of a central organizing committee. The Obron model is a little bit different. So the Obron model, instead of building businesses from the ground up, the Obron model seeks to go in and acquire already existing businesses and then convert them to the worker owner, one member, one vote model. And then they become part of a holding company that owns all of the businesses in the network. I'm going to talk about a couple of regional examples, which are really interesting. Some of you may be familiar with the Mondragon model. So Mondragon is a region, the Basque region of Spain. A priest there named Arizmendi, as you can see, that's who they named the bakeries after out here in California. Started actually through an educational model. And it was those first few young folks that he was educating into cooperative economics that then went out and sought to purchase a small manufacturing interest and bring it to their region. I am always particularly inspired by this because here in South Central, we do not have a thriving economy. And I know now from personal experience how extremely hard it is to build businesses from startup. So I'm very interested in this concept that we could also go about acquiring businesses or factories from other places that may be going out of business for a multitude of reasons, relocating them and converting them into worker ownership. So since then, in the 50s and 60s, it has grown to be sort of one of the largest industrial hubs in Europe, with 250 worker cooperatives, all part of the larger organization Mondragon. And those worker cooperatives just, it runs the gamut. I have met folks who work in their advertising cooperative. I have met folks who work in their manufacturing cooperatives, the consulting cooperatives, software engineering cooperatives. And then also, their community has a greater ecosystem built around this as well, right? With cooperative healthcare, schools and universities, housing. So these are all the things that I dream of for South Central. It's sort of what I'm always telling folks here. So we're going to build Mondragon in South Central LA. One of the things that stands out about Mondragon is that their pay ratio between a worker and executive is about 1-8. I don't know about there in Canada, but down here in the US, it's something outrageous. I don't know, like 32-1 or even higher than that sometimes. So this pay ratio to me seems quite reasonable because you'll have the ability to pay sort of your management the types of salaries that they would be otherwise potentially sacrificing if they were to not work in corporate and decide to work as a cooperative. So you want to attract great talent, right? You want You want the best minds here at the helm of our organizations, making the long-term strategic decisions. But at the same time, you also want to make sure that all of the other workers in the organization are not earning so little by ratio. As I mentioned, they started out with manufacturing. One of those became known as Feor. I don't know if you're familiar. It's a big global brand. They also have their own cooperative financial institution, something that we're really working on here in South Central as well. Again, just an incredibly large industrial group, 13 billion euros a year in revenue. And they've actually beaten out the rest of Spain by all metrics of success, including having some of the lowest unemployment rates in the country and withstanding almost all of the depressions and recessions that the global economy has gone through. They are incredibly diversified, but they do have an emphasis. They're very focused on transportation and energy, as they do see these two as long-term global trends that they know that they can invest in and bet on for the long term. Now, Emilia Romagna in Italy and Kerala in India, both regions have a very large cooperative economy, maybe not as dense as Mondragon's, but by any other metric, incredibly much more dense than here in the United States, right? I think here in Los Angeles, I could count the number of cooperatives we have on one hand, right? And that would be in a city, Los Angeles as a city having, the population of something like Australia, right? So we have an extremely low cooperative density. It's one of our great struggling points, right? Is how do we get an ecosystem growing and multiplying when right now it feels like we live in a cooperative desert. Now, these two communities in Italy and in India were really created primarily by a strong leftist movement. They're really rooted in like their political parties, universities, lots of union organizing and grassroots movements. So these were economies that were created and developed out of a philosophical perspective on the world, which is true for all of us here. I think that's why many of us are here, is because we have a philosophical and moral impetus that drives us to build more just economies. But I would say that in these regions, it was truly premised on that. There's a few other examples. There's cities that have invested in this, at least here in the United States. New York City is really leading the way. They've passed some regional legislation and funded it in order to incubate worker cooperatives. Madison, Wisconsin stands out for sure. For those of you who haven't seen it, should check out the film that was produced by the founders of the Working World regarding Argentina and the debt restructuring they offered for worker takeovers. And we're working on a public banking initiative here in Los Angeles in order to create the financial institutions that we believe we're going to need to create these ecosystems. But it's really Mondragon, Emilio Romagna, and this community in India, I think, that have inspired our thinking about it, this need for an ecosystem. I really appreciated James' example of how multiple cooperatives working within one ecosystem can assist each other. I think that we've seen that where ecosystems try to grow and thrive where cooperatives try to grow and thrive on their own, it can be incredibly challenging. Strength in numbers, right? For those of you who are know about collective bargaining. So a quick recap about downtown Crenshaw. I'll just stop sharing my screen. Let's see if I'm back in the regular screen here. If I'm not sure how the question and answer thing works here, but feel free to ask questions in whichever way you see fit. So going back to downtown Crenshaw, what are we thinking about? As I mentioned, the first move for us has really had to do with real estate. Los Angeles real estate is it's out of control, just like massive displacement, right? I think lots of you have probably read about, the challenges that we have with homelessness. Um, and then what they don't put in the headlines, right, is that the majority of homeless people are Black folks, which is kind of insane because we're only 13% of the population and yet represent something like 50% of the homeless population, right? So something that isn't mentioned is that this incredible amount of displacement and gentrification and housing instability and housing shortages, are really impacting those of us who are the least capital secure, right? We've got a 400-year history here in the United States for the reasons why we haven't been able to amass any intergenerational wealth and still continue to be hyper criminalized and discriminated against. And then that makes our communities already undercapitalized and insecure. And then you pile on things like skyrocketing housing and COVID, and suddenly we've got, the only place in Los Angeles where the Black population is increasing is on Skid Row. Every other demographic, their population is consistently increasing year over year in Los Angeles. And for us, it's only on Skid Row. So at the root of what we're doing, we had to start with real estate. And it even goes back to what I said about my business, right? My business that I had, which I thought was doing great things, right? Employing 20 to 25 folks, mostly formerly incarcerated folks, giving them living wage jobs, enabling them to take care of their families, secure their housing, build their credit. um, you know, our landlord raised our warehouse rent from $15,000 a year to $26,000. I mean, $15,000 a month to $26,000 a month. And considering that we were already a fairly low margin business and struggling to pay the wages that we really wanted to, there was no way that we could absorb that type of impact. So for me, stabilizing rent is one, the human aspect, right? We have to keep people housed, and we have to stop the rental rates from going up. But it's the same thing for businesses, right? A lot of our small mom and pops owned, Black and brown women owned businesses operate on some fairly small margins and tend not to be very well capitalized. And so small increases like that warehouse rental increase really destabilizes us. And so within the downtown Crenshaw model, we're purchasing single family homes and mostly converting them to duplexes and triplexes. We're purchasing apartment buildings, stabilizing the rents there for the tenants who will also become cooperative owners. But we're also buying a lot of commercial real estate. So we are buying storefronts and restaurants, and anything that can pencil for us. We are purchasing in and around the Lamert Park, sort of Crenshaw district in South Central. And just for this reason, is that we also want to create the businesses that we want to see thriving here. And that was a big call that we got from the community at the time that we did the call to purchase the mall. We had said, okay, we're going to go out and we're going to raise the money for our major retail hub to be purchased and preserved by and for the community. And community members spoke up and said, yes, but we don't want an Apple store and a Starbucks there. We want businesses that are owned by us, that employ us. It's been an ongoing struggle in the Crenshaw district that every time they have allowed for developments, like the bringing out of a new Walmart or an Albertsons or something like that, there was supposed to be local hire agreements in those community benefit agreements and it's an ongoing joke in our community that these businesses we allow in our community never employ Black folks. It's actually like very well known to the point that it's sort of like just an ongoing colloquial joke. So we're like, okay, how are we going to build businesses that actually will employ us? And cooperative businesses was something that we had all been looking at for a long time, but not a lot of us have seen these in practice, right? So we've attended meetings like these, we've gotten workshops, we've looked at slides, we've read books. If anybody's interested in a great book, I highly recommend Collective Courage. Collective Courage is this amazing book that chronicles the cooperative developments of African Americans in the US since the time of slavery. Starting out with things like collective purchase agreements. They would go in and save money in order to buy each. It was a savings and loan program, basically, where slaves could save money to buy each other sequentially out of slavery. Going to Tulsa, Oklahoma, we think of that that massacre and those riots and the burnings of Black Wall Street. Well, Black Wall Street makes you think of a capitalist model, where in reality, I think it was like 1 in 3 businesses in Tulsa, Oklahoma at the time were cooperatives. They were cooperative grocery stores and credit unions. So we have all of these great examples, but to be very honest, most Americans know almost nothing about how to organize ourselves in a cooperative or mutual aid model, as we've been discussing this evening. So what we found is that, while we're aggressively buying real estate, we also cannot just expect people to somehow like wake up overnight and be able to reframe their entire worldview around a new cooperative utopia. There are serious challenges to be overcome with sort of changing our mindsets when we've been so well trained and programmed into coming to work and having a boss, deferring to others for decision making, expressing almost like, individual autonomy to the exclusion of all else, right? I mean, America's obsession with like the rugged individualism, it's all very much ingrained in our thinking, and dismantling some of this stuff has been, actually the first step for a lot of this. So we took some advice from those ecosystems that I was just showing you on the slides, right? We talked to our friends in Mondragon. We talked to our friends at Arizmendi. We talked to our friends at the healthcare co-op. We talked to folks at the Evergreen model, and we were just like, where do we start? And what almost all of them said was, well, start like the priest Arizmendi and Mondragon did, with basically a study group. Now, this has been going on for years, and the people who attend it have changed over time. But really, the study group part is like the very first, but so important and like cannot be skipped step, which is getting folks together to just learn about the history of these models, how they work, where they work, and how different they all are from each other. It's not a one size fit all thing by any means. Literally every cooperative I've seen has a very different like structure for how they organize themselves. But there are some best practices, and those are best practices that, of course, we want to share, right? We don't want to be reinventing the wheel all the time. So we've been starting with that. We had a structured study group. Then we created basically what's a development group, right? So this is like sort of 20 or 30 folks. The overall downtown Crenshaw membership is like something like 2,000 people. But I will say it's probably more like a core group of like 60 or 80 folks who do a lot of the real essential organizing, right? So everything from like going to look at apartments when they're for sale to like actual like, okay, let's go picket and protest at this guy's house to get him to stop buying something in our neighborhood. So we've got a lot going on there. And then so of that universe, there's even a smaller subset that's more like 15 folks here in Los Angeles that are really committed to this cooperative development sort of work that we're doing. And then again, we went back to our friends sort of all over the world and said, okay, what should our first project be? And you'd be surprised to hear the resounding answer was a bakery. So we're starting with a co-op bakery, and here's why. There's a couple of good reasons. One, bakeries have very affordable inputs: flour, water, butter, right? So you have a limited number of like vendor relationships and vendor pricing that you need to negotiate, which is fairly stable, usually, hopefully, when Russia isn't invading Ukraine or whatever. So with those sort of fairly stable input prices, then you can create a fairly stable payment structure, right? So now you can pay people pretty good wages, and the training to get from walking in the door day one to being a full-fledged baker is quite short. And so that's the reason why this bakery model has worked in multiple places, because you can get someone in the door, you get them trained up to baker in a fairly short amount of time. Your inputs are limited and low priced. And so we're working on building a bakery. Now, there's a couple other sort of good things about bakeries, right? They're actually public facing. Now, when I go about setting about choosing a business, I tend actually to shy away from public facing businesses because dealing with customers from the general public can be quite trying and taxing. But there's a reason why bakeries have worked really well in this is because it's a political education platform, right? It's the Black Panther model of political organizing and education, right? Black Panthers had breakfast and lunch for the community because once they got people butts and seats, then you could teach them the righteous politics. So that's really what these bakeries are, right? It's an easy model for creating living wage jobs, and it's a fairly low cost, low skill model, and it allows you to interact with your community and do political education all along the way. So our first cohort of bakers, we've got it's a mixed bag. Like I think about half of them actually have previous restaurant, maybe not bakery, but restaurant and food service background, and then the other half are coming, completely fresh to it. And they're actually just more interested in the cooperative aspect of it than the baking so much, which is fine because you need a little bit of both because there will be some specialization. Now, I believe in the Arizmendi model, folks are required to rotate through the multiple circles. So James has been using this vocabulary around circles, which is the sociocracy model, which we are also in the process of educating ourselves about here in South LA. We recently just completed out like a 3-4 day training that we held at a local community center, open to the community, but focused on our cohort. But it requires that everybody goes through all of the circles. So at any time in your career at Arizmendi, you may be working in the marketing circle, you may be working on the bakery development, you may be working on vendor relations, depending on your circles. You may be in the new business development segment. Arizmendi actually just a few years ago spun off to also build an ADU company. ADU might be jargon that doesn't make sense to Canadians, but it was a law passed in California that single family homeowners could build small like granny units, like 1 bedroom or 2 bedroom units in the back of their homes. It was intended to create more housing density to deal with some of those housing issues I was talking about earlier. So, Arizmendi's working up in San Francisco, Berkeley area, very different demographic than South Central for sure. But I mean, we both arrived at the same sort of conclusion, right? Which is, how do we use cooperative land ownership and cooperative businesses to also create housing density and affordable housing? Right? So it's like we have all the same pieces of the equation. We're just sort of assembling them in different orders. So Arizmendi is very interesting because all of their bakeries have actually been extremely profitable year over year, which may also just speak to the fact that, the Bay Area in Los Angeles is a very wealthy and high income area. But they've reinvested those monies, also into increasing pay for their workers, but reinvesting into building out new bakeries and reinvesting into building out this new sort of construction and landscaping cooperative. So we've been following along with them and their model, very much under their mentorship as we develop ours. But not always perfectly, right? Because there's also cultural competency issues, right? Like we're in South Central as Black folks, it's hard for us to necessarily trust a group of white hippies giving us financial advice. So we had to take what they were teaching us and then also find our own way to a certain extent. And it's been an interesting journey. I think we're on track probably to get baking with the bakers like this coming summer. So we've been training for about a year now. But we know we encounter challenges along the way. Like, for example, interpersonal issues. That is a real, true story. Like that happens. And people wonder, they think that they're going to join a cooperative and suddenly it's going to be like this, utopian land of like fairies and butterflies. And it's not. I mean, it's still work. And you still end up sometimes working with people who frustrate you. I remember one of the women from Arizmendi, she was so funny. She said on one of the calls, she was like, look, I've worked at Arizmendi for 23 years. There are people there who will be my lifelong friends. And there are people there that when I retire, I never want to see them again. So it's all of those things are in there. But what's important about this model is that just like any workplace that we go to now, right? There's checks and balances, there's structures within them that allow for us to come to work and get our work done, and not necessarily have to get along with everybody, right? Not necessarily have to think that everyone there is our absolute like best friend and soulmate. Yes, you do team building, and yes, you want to aspire for, in sociocracy, what is the phrase they always have, right? Like, uh, good enough for now, safe enough to try, right, like this idea that we're willing to work together to make compromises and take risks and move forward. But so I think it was about the middle of last year. Yeah, we did have a couple people in our cooperative who, were very angry. They didn't think that they had been included. They were feeling like the rest of the team was maybe like railroading them. And then we realized, we really needed to build in those structures and mechanisms for mediation or moderation. And that was also advice that Arizmendi gave us very early on. They said, you should have a third party, what's the word? Like a third party facilitator who can step in the case of that, and then you should have some pretty clean rules within your bylaws, about what the next steps are when these things happen. So those are like hiccups along the way, but also learning, right? Because you want to learn that when you're a group of 6 or 10, right? You don't want to suddenly have to learn this when you're a group of like 30 or 40 and there's like a huge faction within your organization that could threaten the actual health and well-being of the business itself. So that's one sort of learning or tip or trick I can give you guys. I saw that you guys like the sociocracy training. I would recommend everyone to delve into that, really early on. We are learning it later to help us sort of overcome some of those communication challenges that we were having. But there were folks in our group that were advocating for it early on, and we kind of shrugged them off because it looked really complicated and intimidating and unknown and maybe unnecessary. And looking back, if we had just made the commitment to learn that process really well and thoroughly early on, we might have saved ourselves a little bit of heartache there. I don't know. Everything's, like everything's 2020 in retrospect. So, what else can I offer to tell you guys about what we're doing? I'm not sure how much time I had or if I ran over time. I also didn't take any questions on the slides. So if you guys want to ask about any of those other examples that I talked about, I'd be happy to elaborate there as well.
Can you hear me now? Oh, yes, you can. Wonderful. Nikki, I just want to say thank you so much for everything that you've given to us. We do have a couple of questions, actually, that were in the chat. If you don't mind, I would love to ask them now, if I can find them here. Here we go. Question. You mentioned that you were going to try and become your own financial institution. How does that work? You might have already answered this, but be curious to hear your idea.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. The answer is I don't know yet. But so right now we are putting together a microloan product with the Seed Commons. The Seed Commons is part of the working world. They are an incredible resource for all things cooperative, including capital. So we're going to do that with them and through them. They've kind of already set up their lending mechanisms and agreements and things like that. And we have some funds that we raised from donors. So that's kind of a first baby step is for us to get this track record as a lender, because that's one of the requirements for, at least here in the US, of becoming what's called like a CDFI, or a community development corporation. And so we're going to start by doing a partnership with microloans. I actually have a personal not so great feeling about microloans. I think they actually set small businesses up to fail sometimes, because it's it's like just a little bit enough of money to like get yourself in trouble, like just enough rope to hang yourself with. So I see our microloan program actually not as a solution for what we really need to do, right? Which is properly capitalize small businesses. But it's our baby step to building the track record that we need to have a larger financial institution where we then will be able to get state and federal funds and other banking deposits in, and then use those to lend out. Now, we have been talking to a lot of our work was originally funded by donors, but I had this great privilege also of attending a conference a few weeks ago that was social impact investors, right? So it's all these guys that a lot of it is big foundation money, and a lot of it is like, I guess they call them private family offices, right? So very wealthy individuals who've inherited their wealth. Do you have a comment that you would like to add to this, baby? Sorry, I got a kid here that wants to put her 2 cents in. But when we went there, we did find. Hang on a second. We did get the chance to meet a lot of folks who said that they would be willing to put in deposits for fairly low returns. And so we think that we would have that as an opportunity as well, to find like social impact investors who are willing to take rather low returns in order to capitalize, a lending arm of something that we might set up. I'm not a financial professional though. Like, we're just going to have to like hire somebody to do that. But I think we have like an idea of what the roadmap might look like. I'm going to step away for 1 second and get her set up with a movie.
Not a problem. Well, you're stepping away and taking care of that. I'll just read some comments that we have in the chat here, just as soon as I can find it. We have someone saying righteous politics with a heart behind them. We have who doesn't love bakeries? It's a good question. We do have someone saying what a great speaker and topics for this stage of VAWMA's development. We have a comment here. This is where you need to understand how LETS, which is, I believe, an acronym, can work for co-ops. The Schumacher Society in America will help you understand how this can work. Are you familiar with the Schumacher Society? Or you're still taking care of stuff? In that case, I'll go back and take another comment here. An epic philodendron. Ooh, that's a new word to me. I'm going to have to look that up when I go home. That'll be fun. So yeah, we have a lot of ideas here. Oh, you're back. Wonderful.
Yes, I was thinking about my philodendron, my plant up there. My husband has it strung all over the house.
Oh, there you go. That's what that is. Okay, now it's all coming together. We did have a question here from someone on the floor about asking, how do you resolve conflicts within like different or amongst different individuals and perhaps even amongst different competing interests? Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a good one. So we are learning the sociocratic method to try to help with this, because what we found was that the conflict that arose for us wasn't actually so much a difference of view or opinion. It was that people were absorbing information at different rates, right? So some of us maybe we're a little bit further ahead in our co-op education, maybe for a little bit further ahead in our business education. And so we were trying to move faster, right? And then others who had maybe just shown up and didn't totally understand, what we were doing by like having consensus or something like that, or what they didn't necessarily understand how circles worked with each other. They when we arrived at our budget, it's always when the money comes out that people get pissed off. But once we had arrived at our budget, then, top started flying and people were just like, wait, I didn't agree to that. Or I didn't understand that. Or I didn't. And so that made us kind of really walk it back and say, well, okay, this is a saying, this is actually like an African proverb that governs a lot of our work at Downtown Crenshaw, which is, if you want to go somewhere fast, go alone. But if you want to go somewhere far, go together. So we're really trying to walk it back and make sure that we're doing those check-ins for mutual like understanding at every step along the way, because people feeling like they had been like railroaded or they didn't get the opportunity to speak. And sociocracy has that built in. That's what's so cool about sociocracy. It's just like built in. As long as you just follow the steps, you should be okay. But you also need good facilitators. So I think, we're probably going to invest some more time in training a few folks who have the desire and capacity to become facilitators in that specific art form. The same is true and analogous, I think, in any business, right? I work for a nonprofit right now. We have to go through management training. So it's like everybody has to like pick up some new skills aside from their core skill in order to kind of like help the organization grow in capacity and to resolve conflicts when they come up. I think that's all I have to say about that for now. But I will update you next year and let you know how it's going.
Thank you. I appreciate it. That's one of the most reoccurring questions that I have come up to me when I talk about the cooperative ideas. Okay, well, it's all fine and good, but what are you going to do when there's people don't agree with each other? So it's always great to hear real world examples and people's experiences with yeah, it's not all rose garden. It's not all tiptoeing through the tulips. It's sometimes you're walking on eggshells, and but I like hearing that you're discovering more and more tools that you can use to put at your disposal in order to help resolve those conflicts. That gives me hope. So yeah, we do have one or two more questions here. If you have a moment.
Yeah.
So the other question here, and this kind of relates: what is the biggest roadblock that most co-ops come against when trying to start up? Yeah, it's kind of what you've been the topic of your conversation tonight.
Yeah. So I think the key two words that you put together in the question was roadblock and startup. So the startup part, I feel like, is the problem more than the co-op part. It's just because, even when I was starting my business, my tire recycling business, which was fairly straightforward, right? We collect tires, we charge people to collect those tires, we take them somewhere, we make a product, and then we sell those products. You still have this really long ramp up period. It's like, I don't know, it depends on the business, but it can be 1, 2, 5 years of basically where you're discovering your vendors and your customers, right? It's where you're really figuring out how much is it actually going to cost me to make my widget or my doohickey, right? Where am I going to buy this from? How much is the rent going to cost? How many actual like human hours does it take? And how much are those people paid? And like just figuring out that actual like cost basis to a T, like to really good and stabilizing that. And then the flip side is where's your revenue coming from? Who are your key customers? What volumes are they buying at? How much are they paying, right? How much price elasticity do they have, right? Can you charge a little bit more? Are they going to constantly, for me, my customers were always grinding me down on price, forcing me to compete with other people on price. And it was this horrible race to the bottom. But those are things that you discover once you've been in business, say 5 years or so. I think that's what here in the US, our small business SBA, like they say that you're not a startup anymore after 5 years because they feel like after 5 years, you've figured out all that stuff. And that's what's really turned me to being more interested in acquiring businesses and turning them into worker cooperatives. Because even if that business is struggling a little bit, or, even if that business, what happens with a lot of businesses is their ownership is just tired and wants to retire or move away and do something else. The fundamentals of the business are there, right? The fundamentals of what do they buy? How much do they pay? At what volumes, right? So they don't have inventory overage or inventory shortage. How much does the transportation cost, right? All of those things. And then they have long-term customer relationships, which is also very hard to build. It takes a long time. It takes, 2, 3, 5 years. So to me, that's where most startups fail is your startup can get through those 5 years if it's properly capitalized, right? Like, do you have a Facebook runway? Like, is somebody going to give you $200,000-$300,000 just to learn for 2, 3, 4 years? I should hope so. That's the dream. I mean, that's like what I'm asking in reparations. I'm like, y'all just need to give us reparations and then we can figure it all out. But since that's probably not going to happen, I think that the best thing we can do right now is maybe find businesses that are small and have the potential for growth, that have been established for a long time, and acquire those and convert them into worker cooperatives. Because the startup phase is like the most challenging. And then you have all these people coming together to be worker cooperatives together for the first time while they're trying to figure out how to do a new business. And that also can create kind of an explosive scenario because everybody's afraid, and that heaviness and that tenseness and that fear that's in your heart like makes you not a great communicator, makes you not a great cooperator.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned that. One of the things that I learned through my healing journey in life was that we can be driven by love or by fear. And when we're driven by fear, it turns off our higher thinking capacities. We go into fight or flight mode. We go into survival mode. Whereas when we're in a safe environment where it's safe for us to be our true authentic selves, that's when we thrive. That's when we shine. And that's when we have the best possibility of using our higher brain functioning at that point. So, yeah. I have one more question, more like a comment, and it has to do with an acronym I'm unfamiliar with, but maybe you're familiar with it. This is, and I believe this had to do with when you were talking about. I don't remember exactly what you're talking about. But this is where you need to understand how LETS, LETS, which I believe is an acronym, can work for co-ops. The Schumacher Society in America will help you understand how this can work. Are you familiar with the Schumacher Society?
I am not.
Maybe something to. I had a conversation with a co-op enthusiast this afternoon who mentioned the Schumacher Society as people that are worth looking into and seeing how they were able to accomplish some of the goals of cooperative working together.
Yeah. Does the person who asked the question want to give the definition of let's?
Ooh, let's see if they're still watching. I'll keep an eye out for them to see if they add anything more. But they also mentioned that sources of money can be local, and the sources will provide guidance and experience as well as support funds. You know, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned about acquiring existing businesses, because part of our, we didn't talk about it tonight, but one of our missions is to do just that, find businesses that are about to, the owner is going to retire, you know, they want to get rid of it, but they, you know, they don't necessarily want to sell to the next major megacorp that's been their competition. They would like to keep it locally owned or locally sourced. And I think the worker-owned model where they can give it to their employees, either in the form of a vendor take back, or we can organize the workers together, have them all chip in a little bit of a buy-in, and then use that consistent buy-in that they're chipping in as leverage to go to cooperatives or credit unions, banks. We have a what I believe is a co-op friendly bank in Canada known as the Van City Community Banking.
I was just watching a video about that.
Right? They're interesting. I just discovered them like a week or two ago, and so I'm excited. The things that they have advertised on their website, that they give like equipment loans up to starting at 500K Canadian, but with 90% down, or with they provide 90% of the loan. So with 10% down, you can get 90% of your equipment loan, starting at 500K. That's a not a bad place to start, depending on what the rate or the interest rates are. So things to look into, but I'm excited for the possibility of people coming together, you know, really to do what they're already doing for others, but for themselves. It's kind of my philosophy and all that.
I wonder if LETS is supposed to stand for something like local equity, something. I have heard of multiple cooperatives doing a thing where they're basically doing a private offering. We're probably going to do one here downtown Crenshaw, where we are going to be going to our sort of socially minded impact investors only. It's not a public offering, and giving them a sort of a debt or note option as a way to invest in our work. I think they're mostly interested in real estate, but I do think when we start looking again at more like co-op acquisitions and conversions, you open up a whole other universe of capital, right? So when your business is less than 5 years old, it is so hard to get any kind of loan. It's like really, really, really hard. But when you are buying a business, they already have a credit track record. And I think that that's going to be super helpful for you guys, for all of us, as we try to do this, because when you have a business with that credit track record, it's going to be so much easier for you to go out and get loans from more traditional financial institutions. Now, if you're looking for equity investments or just co-op interested folks, I will put two organizations on your radar. I already mentioned Seed Commons and the Working World, but also Project Equity. So these are folks who, as far as I can tell, have already raised funds for the purpose of investing in co-ops, right? So they have funds available to help us build the co-ops that we want to have. But I will say this, like all investors, right? Their primary investors have some risk adversity, which they will say things like, oh, we really want you to have been in business this many years. Another great reason to think about acquiring businesses as opposed to building them from scratch.
Indeed. I think there might be one final question or comment. Somebody's saying that they wouldn't mind hearing a bit more about training involved in to run a co-op. How do people learn what they need to know? I think you've already kind of talked a little bit about that, but if you have anything else to add.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we first started, we have just sort of been self-selecting, right? So folks who are definitely bakers, they're over there, making recipes and thinking about pricing and things like that. Me personally, you don't want me anywhere near the kitchen. So I stay with the books and I'm good at doing things like writing business plans. And that works at first, but it's not super sustainable. Like, in order, especially to avert the issue I mentioned earlier, where people felt like the decisions were being made without them, you really want people to rotate through. So, like a lot of, at least Arizmendi, but also I think the healthcare cooperative and some other ones, they have like a regularly scheduled rotation where you have to leave like the circle that you're in and go to another circle for a little while. I haven't been part of one of those, so I can't say how good it is. It sounds super awkward and uncomfortable to me, but I'm sure that there's a reason, right? We do it sometimes at work too, right? Where our jobs force us to go and work on a team that maybe wasn't like our strength, but it's a growth opportunity.
A growth opportunity, I was just going to say. Well, thank you so much, Niki, for everything that you've been able to impart to us tonight. I don't think there are any more questions on the chat. I think we've covered all the major ones. And I think we can even officially call ourselves an official live stream. We were rated by a bot advertising for questionable websites. So I think we've arrived. And with that, I think we can probably bid everybody a fond farewell and a good night. Thank you so much for coming on and for giving us the benefit of your experience. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and let's follow up, and I'm open for more questions anytime.
Wonderful. I may fire off an email. Maybe we can chat more about some of the stuff. I would love that. Thank you. And I'd just like to say now, for everybody who has joined us, I'd like to say thank you. You're awesome. And next week, we're going to have, I'm having a brain fart. I think it's Kevin Gustafsson from the All Things Co-op podcast next week when we talk about how we democratically move our surplus, direct our surplus through our members. So to everybody who's joined, thank you again for coming, and have a good one.